Hi there, this is Solitaire Ronan from Solitaire Ronan Films, and welcome to a new series. I'm going to call this series One Director, 4 Films. Now this is really to get viewers' input. The people who regularly comment on this channel have far more knowledge about films than I do. So this is an audience participation series where I'll be going through one director and 4 of that director's films. So one of the films will be a fundamental film. As we know, most artists have through lines in whatever work they do. Painters, sculptors, film directors, musicians. So one choice will be a fundamental film, a film that if you had to show one film by a director to somebody who had no experience of that director, of what sums up the director and the obsessions and the kind of through lines of the career, that would be the film. So there'll be one fundamental film, one favourite film. And for the purposes of the exercise, obviously there will be some that the fundamental film is the same as your favourite film by this director. But for the purposes of the exercise, let's try and make it different films. So it's just simply your favourite film. Doesn't have to be the best. It's just your favourite film by the director. And obviously some directors, it will be difficult to say what's your favourite, but let's just try. And then the kind of underrated gem, and again this is all subjective, nobody's opinion is fact, especially not mine. And then finally the flounder, the film that it's not your least favourite, but the film that perhaps doesn't quite work. I didn't want to call it a flop because that suggests box office, and we don't really care about box office. And I didn't want to put failure because there's some directors it's very difficult to actually call it a failure, especially if you haven't seen every single film by a director. So we're going to call the 4th film The Flounder. Perhaps just isn't as successful as the director's usual films in theme or execution, and usually there's reasons for that. So that was a really long-winded introduction. So I'll be doing a director per video, and I'll be suggesting the 4 films. But again, this is a series very much like the director battles, that I would really like to see your choices and your 4 films. So I'm going to start with Akira Kurosawa, because it seemed like an appropriate place to start. Again, some directors, some of the choices are going to be really obvious. Some of them might not be. So for my fundamental Kurosawa film, to nobody's surprise, I'm going to pick Seven Samurai. Again, Seven Samurai, I think, is now almost dismissed. You know, very much like The Seventh Seal, it's one of those films that just appears on great films lists, especially for people that don't put lots of foreign films on those lists, non-English language films on those lists. Obviously it's not a foreign film if you live in Japan. So it's almost kind of overlooked now, and I know there is a kind of element that Kurosawa's almost like blasé and he's not as popular as he used to be. But Seven Samurai is one of the most important films ever made. It is a template film. It's been remade so many times, and it shows Kurosawa's mastery of the fluid camera, shot composition. Obviously, it has two different but equally towering performances by Toshiro Mifune and Takeshi Shimura, each doing their own thing. One much more bluster, the other one calm, but exuding equal amounts of power. It's one of the few films that when characters die, you actually feel their loss, which doesn't happen in that many films. Again, it's a template of how to do a group of characters that are more than just a one-dimensional sketch. I mean, in the many versions of the film that have been made, they've ended up being a one-dimensional sketch. The rookie, the professional, the comic relief. But in Seven Samurai, they're all given depth. Kurosawa's almost control of the weather, wind and rain and sun, is evident in the film. So again, if nobody's ever seen a Kurosawa film before, I think Seven Samurai is a pretty good choice as the fundamental film. But again, my opinion is not fact. So again, for me, the favourite is difficult as well. But I've chosen Throne of Blood, Kurosawa's version of Macbeth, with another almost animalistic performance by Toshiro Mifune. Again, wind and rain, fog play very important very important roles. It's a wonderful dark adaptation, just tremendously mounted. Again, a real sense of time and place and creepiness and oddness and stillness, but also brutal. And again, there's a real, the scene where Mifune is lost in the fog, Kurosawa, by letting it continually go on and on and on as they just ride back and forth, continually lost in the fog. And as an audience, you get impatient as well, so you're actually put exactly in the place of Toshiro Mifune just by simply letting it run and run and run. So you get agitated and you get annoyed, and it's like, when are we getting out of the fog? Which is exactly what Toshiro Mifune and his comrade are thinking. A wonderful finale, almost eerie, supernatural, and again, beautifully mounted, and the shot composition is exemplary, as always with Kurosawa. Maybe not always, but for the majority of the time. You could argue Mifune is a little bit melodramatic, but kind of needs it for the rest of the film. And Takashi Shimura is in the film as well, even in a small role. But Throne of Blood, I could have obviously picked quite a lot of other Kurosawa films, but I've went for Kurosawa's Throne of Blood as my favourite. So for the gem, again, I could have went for quite a few, but I'm going to go with Stray Dog. Again, ridiculously not on a Blu-ray. This, along with Drunken Angel, I could have picked Drunken Angel as well as the early Mifune Shimura pairings. This one's absolutely spectacularly good. Absolutely spectacularly good. It must be okay. Again, why is this not on a Blu-ray? It's outrageous. Criterion really needs to sort this out. The story of a rookie cop, or a young cop played by Mifune, who loses his gun and he's partnered with the older, wiser Shimura, who knows all the tricks to try and get it back. Again, Kurosawa's command of the weather. This is one of those films, along with The Good, Bad and the Ugly or Nick Rogue's Walkabout, where you can almost feel the heat coming through the screen when you're watching it. Again, the scenes of Mifune just wandering about in the heat trying to find his gun, and you almost feel as exhausted as he does. Again, it has lots of sly commentary about post-war Japan and the influence of the West, the influence of the US forces being in Japan after the war, and other great performances by the two leads. Again, wonderful shot composition. I'm repeating myself. But Stray Dog is one of those kind of really underrated, not necessarily underrated gems, but just because it's not on Blu-ray yet. But again, I could have picked quite a few. And for the Flounder, it's kind of difficult. Obviously, because I tend to like just about all of Kurosawa's films, there's no film that I heartily dislike. But again, the Flounder is kind of maybe the one that kind of identify with the least, or kind of doesn't work quite as well as these other films. So not surprising, I'm going to pick one of these later ones. So it's Rhapsody in August from 1992. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail on Rhapsody in August, because once I finish my Jodorowsky season, which has only got one film left, I am finally going to start my Kurosawa after Mifune season, which I talked about 5 months ago starting that, but because of work and life in general, doing two directors series at the same time, which I've done before, almost seems like too much work, so that's why I'm waiting until I finish off the last Jodorowsky before I start my Kurosawa after Mifune, and Rhapsody in August will obviously be in that. So I do need to re-watch it. It's been a while. Again, the story of an old woman who looks after her 4 grandkids, finds out she's got a brother in Hawaii, and he wants her to visit him. Yeah, it's just not as... Also, it's one of his smaller films. Obviously, his later career is kind of highlighted by 2 massive films. This is one of his smaller films. Again, I still like it. It's a good film. But it's just not one that I revisit that often. There's a few of his earlier ones I could have picked, but for the Flounder, I'm just going to go with Rhapsody in August from 1992. So thanks very much for watching, and please, if you would be so kind and leave me your 4 films by Kurosawa in each category, because I'm looking forward to reading them and looking forward to continuing this series, whether anybody likes it or not, because I'm going with it. So thanks very much for watching episode 1 of One Director, 4 Films, and hopefully you'll join me again for part 2. This is Soldier Ronan from Soldier Ronan Films, saying farewell.